All about hormones, how they change and how you can manage. There are many hormones in the body. For the purposes of this presentation, we're going to focus on 2 of the steroid hormones. There are 5 steroid hormones that come to mind when we think about hormones: progesterone, estrogen, testosterone, dihydroepiandrosterone or DHEA, and cortisol. This talk is going to focus primarily on the role of estrogen and progesterone in women's monthly cycle, looking at how things change as hormone levels shift over the lifespan. We are going to use this diagram of the menstrual cycle as the framework for the overview of hormones and how they change. Time is shown by the calendar at the bottom of the diagram. The top part of the diagram shows the monthly pattern of hormone release. The middle section tracks the life cycle of the egg, and the lower section shows a cross-section of the uterine lining as it changes over the course of the month. So menstruation starts at and the levels of progesterone and estradiol are low. Follicle-stimulating hormone is released, which tells the ovary to begin maturing the next egg. The selected egg will start to secrete estrogen. By day 4 to 5, the uterine lining has about finished shedding. Estradiol levels rise as the egg matures, and this promotes growth of the uterine lining again. Days 7 through 13, the follicle continues to develop, as does the lining of the uterus, getting ready for implantation. By day 12, progesterone levels start to rise. By day 14, rising estradiol levels signal luteinizing hormone to be released, which in turn signals follicle release from the ovary. The ovum then starts the journey along the fallopian tube. Days 15 through 21, the uterine lining continues to thicken, ready for a fertilized egg to implant. The corpus luteum, which is the packing around the egg, makes estradiol and progesterone to signal the endometrium linings to stop growing and to mature and strengthen, ready for a newly fertilized egg. Progesterone levels are at the highest days 7 to 8 after ovulation. Days 25 to 28, if no egg is fertilized and implanted, then both progesterone and estradiol levels will begin to drop. The lining gradually loses its structure, and menstruation begins again. So that was the overall structure. Now let's turn to look at how this pattern can change. We're going to do a quick overview of how the pattern changes at different stages in a woman's life. First of all, PCOS. PCOS is a condition linked to the way the body processes insulin after it has been produced by the pancreas to regulate blood sugar. A high-carb diet over time can dysregulate the body's ability to manage insulin. The cells become resistant to insulin. And when this happens, insulin no longer can be easily absorbed into the cells and used for energy. This means insulin levels rise, and when insulin levels rise, the ovaries and the adrenal glands are stimulated to produce larger amounts of testosterone. As testosterone levels rise, that elevated level can turn off the signaling for the ovaries to release the egg. The eggs still begin the process of developing and maturing each month, particularly the one that has been selected each month, but are never released. This leads to poly or many cystic follicular cysts sitting in the ovaries. You end up with a situation or condition called Polycystic Ovarian Syndrome. Elevated testosterone suppresses ovulation. So progesterone levels, which is the orange line in the diagram, are lower. The endometrium doesn't strengthen and can begin to shed earlier. Cycles frequently shorten, but the reverse can also occur. Without progesterone signals, estrogen signals the message to keep developing the uterine lining, so bloating and discomfort occurs. Eventually, the lining will shed and can cause cramping at that point. So, hormone changes, although they are natural, they do bring a range of challenging symptoms. Here's a list of the most common ones that are associated with hormone changes, in particular where there is more estrogen in relation to progesterone. We tend to think about mood swings and irritability and possibly depression as some of the most common issues related to this imbalance in hormones. But there are a whole host of symptoms. Some of these are merely uncomfortable, but some of them are harbingers of risk for other issues. Now, a quick word about pregnancy and postpartum. Of course, there are huge subjects all in themselves, but I want to draw attention to the impact that changing levels, particularly in progesterone, can have postpartum and on postnatal depression. One of the contributors to postnatal depression is that sudden drop in hormones after delivery. The baby, and therefore the mother, were bathing in progesterone during pregnancy, making sure the uterine lining was strong and the pregnancy is viable. Progesterone is important for maintaining mood through its influence on neurotransmitters, especially GABA, which is one of the calming neurotransmitters. So the sudden drop is almost like progesterone withdrawal. And if cycles can take a while to resume after delivery, that low progesterone state can last for months. Now, this is one of my favorite slides. I think it's so useful as it indicates how the two different hormones, estrogen and progesterone, change at different rates over time. You see the top level, the estrogen level. Although that is beginning to change a little bit around age 35, what you will see underneath it is the progesterone level, and that progesterone level is dropping much faster than the estrogen level. And as we know by now, it is the imbalance between the two that can lead to symptoms. Okay, let's go back to that list of symptoms again. Now we understand a little bit more. Why? Because we have this imbalance. And as we get older and we're dealing with different issues, into our mid-30s and beyond, oftentimes we're at a different stage in our lifestyle. Our careers can be busy. We may have a family. When you add in an imbalance of hormones, you're potentially interrupting sleep. You're increasing the range of symptoms that the body is having to adjust to, and that can pile on a whole bunch of stress on the body. As you're, we don't have time in this presentation to talk about the impact of stress. We'll do that in another, but cortisol and the stress hormones also play into this. So making sure that we have a balance in our bodies between progesterone and estrogen is important at any time, but particularly through this transition period. A word about breast health. Estrogen in women is produced mainly in the ovaries. It is important for sexual development and other body functions. From the first monthly period all the way until menopause, estrogen stimulates normal breast cells. A higher lifetime exposure to estrogen may increase breast cancer risk. Now, as we're understanding, progesterone is a natural counterbalance to estrogen. Estrogen is a proliferative hormone. It stimulates cell growth. Progesterone is a regulator of that growth. So progesterone, like estrogen, is primarily made in the ovaries, but unlike estrogen, it is primarily produced at ovulation. A little bit is made in the adrenal glands and some of the other cells around the organs around the body, but most of it is produced at ovulation in the corpus luteum, that sac that surrounds the egg. So if someone is no longer ovulating on a regular basis, maybe they begin to miss one cycle out of another, or if they do have a polycystic ovarian syndrome situation where they're just not ovulating on a regular basis, they're still producing the estrogen, but not matching that with progesterone. So we are setting ourselves up for estrogen dominance in that situation. And so any cell that thrives on estrogen, such as breast cells, will respond to these rising estrogen levels. Breast tissue can become denser and be more susceptible to cell cancer growth. Fibrocystic breasts can be a result of changes in the cycle, particularly as a result of declining progesterone levels. And progesterone supplementation can be a good idea starting in perimenopause, when those symptoms start to appear. It doesn't need to be much, but a little bit of supplementation can balance out very nicely those elevated estrogen levels. Someone using topical progesterone, it's typically applied to the thin areas of the skin because you want it delivered into the capillaries really quickly. But it can be applied directly onto tender breast tissue in the short term, just in the short term, to help reduce breast swelling. You always want to make sure you do that only for a few days, because progesterone will build up in the tissue and be less effective over time. The reason for this is that all the steroid hormones are lipophilic. They like fat, and if you apply steroid hormones through a topical cream onto fatty tissue, they'll just go right in there and sit there, and that's not what you want. You want them delivered into the blood system so that they can be transported to all sorts of receptors all over the body. So menopause isn't sudden. It's really a phase of transitions, one after another. Gradually, cycles will lengthen, or the gaps between the periods get longer. Some women will have a period every 3 to 4 months for a while. Others simply stop. Someone who is supplementing with progesterone for days 8 to 28 of the cycle can actually have a high degree of control over this time. The regular signaling that comes from progesterone can not only regulate cycles, but can also reduce a lot of the symptoms. Progesterone, incidentally, can also actually be used to help diminish the frequency and intensity of hot flashes. Hot flashes are most visible during the day, but they happen at night also. And this can begin to interfere with sleep, and that's a sure road to chaos and mayhem in anybody's brain. So let's return to this diagram again. If we look around age 60, eventually estrogen levels do drop, and many of the symptoms related to hormone imbalance between estrogen and progesterone will resolve. But wait, we're not done yet. Women are now living up to 30 years or more beyond menopause, which was kind of our genetically programmed time to cease existence. The hormones that were so important to our function have dwindled considerably, and that carries some consequences. Just when we thought we got to the point of no longer worrying about pregnancy, most likely having our children out of the house and launched into the world, a whole new set of surprises are in store. Here are some of those symptoms that can be frequently experienced when women have low estrogen levels. Hot flashes, we mentioned, and just about everybody knows about those. But vaginal dryness, low body temperature, thinning skin, painful intercourse that comes, of course, from vaginal dryness, incontinence, and increased frequency of urinary tract infections. It turns out estrogen is really important for maintaining the integrity of that vaginal tissue, and there are a whole host of symptoms that can occur if estrogen levels are low. So what can we do about supplementation? Well, any supplementation should always be preceded by testing. Testing creates a baseline of your hormone levels and provides the framework from which your practitioner will then recommend supplementation. And this is particularly important when considering the use of estradiol, particularly if there is a family history of hormone-mediated breast cancer. The debate still rages about how long to use hormone replacement therapy, and even surprisingly, the debate between synthetic and bioidentical supplementation. We'll save that for another presentation. Many practitioners understand that estrogen plays a role in over 400 processes in the body, as does progesterone. And women do not stop needing these hormones just because they are no longer reproducing. There are two estrogen hormones to think about when supplementing: estradiol, E2, which is the most potent of the hormones of the estrogens, and estradiol or estriol or E3. Estriol is a weaker hormone but can be very effective, in particular for vaginal use. So a word about cognition. As we live longer, our culture is seeing a rapid rise in dementias and other memory issues. Hormones play a big role in cognitive function. Earlier this year, we produced a white paper that summarizes much of the recent literature on hormones and cognition, and that is available for anybody who would want to read that. But here's a quick summary. Both progesterone and estrogen are important for maintaining brain health. Progesterone has been documented as playing an important role in cognition since it influences brain regions involved in memory, especially visual memory. Both estradiol and progesterone are associated with changes in activation patterns during verbal processing. Frequently, we hear women say, "Oh, what's that word? What's that word?" And they're snapping their fingers and they're trying to remember what that word is. It's common in women as their hormone levels begin to change that they can't quite grasp that word. There is some evidence for beneficial effect of estrogen alone on verbal memory in younger, naturally postmenopausal women, and more consistent evidence from small studies of surgically postmenopausal women. So women who, for example, have a hysterectomy early on. There is evidence that it suggests that supplementing with estrogen can be really important for maintaining brain health in women who do have early hysterectomy. Changes in memory and verbal processing could be indicators of low estrogen, and so supplementation with estrogen is worth considering. Again, make sure that testing is done to make sure that levels do need to be supplemented. Hormone fluctuations are simply part of life. There are things that we can do to help reduce the impact of those. I hope this presentation, though brief and fast, has illustrated how you can navigate through all these changes with vibrance and vitality. If you would like to learn more, talk with me about my book, A Forecast for Health: Understanding Your Potential Lifelong Wellness. This is a book that I wrote for women so that they could understand a little bit more about the biochemistry of the body, what's going on, and where they can make a difference. Thanks for listening, and thanks for being here.